Well, it's a fascinating situation, and it begs the question, is this just an armed mutiny or is this a coup? I think we all know that Prigozhin and his private military company, Wagner, who had vowed last September, October to give a victory to Putin that the Russian army hadn't been able to achieve at Bakhmut, took until really only last month before they achieved that. And in the course of doing so, created a tremendous spat of great vitriol between the Wagner group and Defense Minister Shergoy and Chief of General Staff Gerasimov over the supply of ammunition. Now, hitherto, Prigozhin has not criticized Putin directly and has kept his fire for Shergoy and Gerasimov. But in the last 24 hours, he seems to have crossed a Rubicon and is now criticizing Putin directly. And practically, it would appear that his troops are now marching north up the M4 highway towards Moscow. And this must be a physical, an actual, as well as a political challenge to Putin. What is going to happen next? It's fascinating to see.
What does it say about the Russian military, the state of Russian defences, if Prigozhin can just march up the motorway, the M4 motorway, as you said? The governor of the region of Lipetsk, which lies southeast of Moscow, has urged citizens to stay indoors, but has confirmed that Wagner troops are moving within his territory towards Moscow. What does that say about Moscow and the fact that, somebody with a grudge on Putin could just march straight up to the city?
Well, what does this say about the Russian army? Armies can be involved to support the state, to support the regime, or they can choose not to do so. Mm-hmm. Now, who is the head of the army? The answer is it's General Valery Gerasimov. Now, if we'd had this conversation 6 months ago, at the time of the humiliating Russian reverses in Ukraine around Kharkiv and Kherson, I would have said that the group of leaders in Russia who were most disenchanted were the generals. And it was conceivable then that if there was going to be a coup against a Kremlin coup against Putin, it was conceivable it could have been Gerasimov, the head of the army, that might have mounted that. Now, is that fantasy or is there some substance in that? Ask yourself the question, why was it 3 or 4 months ago that to remove that particular possibility, Putin sent Gerasimov out of Moscow, where he is the head of the overall army, but to be the operational, the theatre commander in Ukraine? That removed him from the chessboard in Moscow. So let's put the sort of all these things together. Maybe, despite the spat between Gerasimov and Prigozhin over the last few months, that Gerasimov sees some advantage in Prigozhin being the means by which Putin is unseated, and that there is therefore a power vacuum in Moscow, and he, Gerasimov, or others, or someone that he supports, could move in and take control. Maybe Prigozhin would like to be the leader himself, but maybe he's quite content to be the person that wields the knife, and someone else takes control. There are many questions here. The answers will emerge over the next little while, but it's certainly fascinating. And if I was Vladimir Putin, I'd be a very worried man and not thinking much about my pension.
Can we take it as read that if the Wagner troops continue to make their progress towards Moscow, north on that M4 motorway, that Vladimir Putin has lost control of his armed forces? Because, as you mentioned, Lord Dannatt, that means that any Russian troops standing in the way of Prigozhin are just allowing him to go through, and therefore could we say that they're supporting him, or they're trying to be neutral, sort of standing out of his way? What can we read into his progress towards Moscow?
Or they could just be acquiescing. I mean, right. Go back in history when Napoleon came back from exile and landed in 1815. The French army loyal to the king opposed him, but they changed sides. And Napoleon went on, and for 100 days it looked as if he could have become the scourge of Europe, but he was stuffed at Waterloo. So these things have happened in the past. But although the regular army under Gerasimov might be willing to play a neutral role, we mustn't forget that Putin is an unreformed KGB colonel. Now the FSB takes on that mantle, and Putin is surrounded by FSB, former KGB diehards, and they control elements of the Interior Ministry and the National Guard. And it may well be that if the regular army is not going to oppose Prigozhin, it may be that other forces will. So we have to watch with interest to see whether there is fighting, and on the regime side, who is conducting it. Is it the army or is it Interior Ministry troops? We just don't know at this stage. It is absolutely fascinating.
Lord Dannatt, finally, from the West's point of view, as you say, we watch and wait. We know that NATO countries bordering Russia are starting to think about mobilizing their troops towards the border. What's the best case scenario from the West's point of view in this situation?
Well, I think two things. One is it's perfectly reasonable for those NATO countries and other countries, well, NATO countries that have a common border with Russia to mobilize troops to take up a deterrent posture. While we have to keep saying as often as we possibly can that NATO is only a defensive alliance and we have no aggressive or offensive motivation as far as Russia is concerned. NATO is first and foremost and only a defensive alliance. Then the second point is, of course, what effect is this going to have on the Ukrainian offensive? We know that over the last 2 or 3 weeks, it's been going quite slowly. I think going quite slowly by design, as the Ukrainians have been probing the Russian defensive lines to find where the weak spots might be. Now, if they have found by now 1 or 2 weak spots, this could well be the moment when there is huge confusion within Russia, huge confusion amongst the Russian military commander control, for the Ukrainians to launch their between 10 and 12 Western equipped and well-trained maneuver brigade groups into a potential breakthrough situation and really change the battlefield situation in Ukraine. If that were to happen, allied with what Prigozhin is doing, then Putin's days are numbered in a handful and probably even less. This could be a really interesting aspect. Fascinating in the short term, but then there are wider considerations in the medium to long term, which, taken from the Western perspective, aren't actually really quite as exciting. But what's going to happen over the next 24 hours, 48 hours, is not anyone's guess, but it's going to be absolutely fascinating beyond belief to watch what's going to happen.